The marble floor of Il Verso was still wet from the rain she'd tracked in, and the man who ran the place was flat on his back in the middle of it, out cold, his open palm bleeding where the broken bottle had caught him. The dining room had closed an hour earlier. Nobody was coming. Della Mercer was 26, still zipped into the insulated jacket of a food delivery driver. Somebody's cold order forgotten by the door, and half her face was wrong because for 4 years she'd painted it on every morning. Deliberately loud, deliberately cheap, a mask built so nobody would look at her twice, and a wet bar towel had just taken most of it off. What was underneath was the whole problem. It always had been. The other man in the room hadn't raised his voice once. Vittorio Sorrentino was 37, his cuffs still buttoned, his breathing perfectly even, and half the Boston waterfront answered to his name whether it wanted to or not. He'd come up from the wine cellar for a folder. He hadn't expected anyone to be standing in his mother's restaurant on Hanover Street at 11 at night. He crossed the floor without hurrying, put a hand on the bar on either side of her so she'd stop trying to run, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he's been told doesn't exist. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask her name. He asked, "Do you belong to anyone?" And Della, shaking, mascara running, said the only honest thing she had left. No. That was the mistake. Because the man on the floor had called her by a name she'd buried 4 years earlier, in a grand jury room at the Suffolk County Courthouse, in front of 23 strangers, who'd listened to every word she said, and then decided she wasn't worth believing. And the man standing in front of her now was about to find out exactly why. If you enjoy stories where the quietest person in the room turns out to be the strongest, hit that like button for us. Share this one with somebody who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Now let's go back 11 days, to the morning Della sat in her car at 5, painting her face so the world would leave her alone. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the parking lot behind the supermarket in Everett was nearly empty, and Della Mercer sat in her car with the engine off, lowered the rearview mirror, and began the most familiar task of her day. She opened a compact of foundation, 2 shades darker than her skin, dabbed 4 dots onto her forehead, cheekbones, and chin, then rubbed it in with her fingertips until her entire face looked flat and dull, with nowhere left for the light to catch. She didn't blend it along her jawline. Instead, she deliberately left a distinct border just beneath her jawbone, where the foundation ended and her neck remained its natural color, the kind of line anyone who had studied makeup for even a week would know to erase. She left it there. Then she picked up an eyeliner pencil and drew a line far thicker than necessary, extending it beyond the outer corner of each eye, before intentionally leaving it slightly uneven, the left side a little higher than the right. She brushed shimmering purple eyeshadow all the way to her brows, a color suited only to the stage and colored lights. She filled in her eyebrows with a black pencil, dark and sharply angled, turning their natural curves into 2 stiff, straight strokes. Last came the lipstick, an earthy orange mixed with brown, a shade she had chosen because it made her teeth look dull and forced anyone facing her to notice only her mouth and forget the rest of her face. At the corners, she colored slightly beyond the natural line of her lips. Then she sat upright, looked into the mirror, and performed the only test she trusted. She silently counted to 3, stared directly at herself, and asked whether anyone would want to look at this face a second time. The answer was no. She folded the mirror back into place. The entire process took 11 minutes, and she had done it every morning for 4 years, even when she was sick, even when she had slept only 3 hours, even on the morning she took her grandmother to the hospital. Her phone vibrated in its holder. It wasn't the delivery app. It was an email from Harborview Assisted Living in Revere, sent at 4:52 that morning, with a subject line beginning with the words, "Notice of Fee Adjustment." Della read the entire message in 40 seconds. Ruth Mercer's Social Security benefits still covered most of the cost of her room and basic care, but the facility had just increased the family's additional monthly contribution from $380 to $600, effective with the next billing cycle, with payment due by the last day of the month. Beneath that was a line in smaller print, written in a voice so polite it became cruel, stating that if the difference wasn't paid within 60 days, the facility would have to discuss transfer options with the family. Della knew what transfer options meant. It meant another facility, farther away and more crowded, where her grandmother would have to learn everyone's names all over again, while forgetting a little more with every passing week. She opened her banking app. $214. She stared at the number longer than necessary, then closed the app without calculating anything, because there was no calculation to make. She signed into the delivery app and accepted a shift. The first order came in at 5:23 from a coffee shop in Malden, 2 drinks and a bag of pastries, delivered to a man already waiting on his front porch. He took the bag without looking at her and merely said thank you toward the door. The second order was breakfast for a construction site in Charlestown, 9 meals, and the foreman made her arrange every container on a folding table before checking them twice. The third was for a 4th-floor apartment without an elevator in Somerville, where the customer had left a note instructing her to leave the order outside the door, not to knock, and not to ring the bell. The fourth went to a dental clinic in Medford, where the young woman at the reception desk told her to set it on a chair before turning back to her computer screen. By 11 o'clock that morning, Della had completed 9 deliveries and earned $78, including tips. She ate half a sandwich she had bought the day before while sitting in her car in a parking lot near a gas station, and she made the calculation she had sworn she wouldn't make. $600 a month meant $20 a day, which meant 3 additional deliveries every day, without a day off, without getting sick, without the car breaking down. Her car had already traveled 210,000 miles. She put the remaining half of the sandwich back into its paper bag and folded the top closed. At that exact moment, her phone gave a sharp chime, and a new order appeared on the screen. The pickup location was on Hanover Street in the North End. The advance tip was $22, 3 times the usual amount for such a short distance. Della sat up straighter and stared at the restaurant's name printed in bold at the top of the screen. Il Verso. Della parked 1 block from Hanover Street and walked the rest of the way with the insulated bag slung over her shoulder. The front door of Il Verso opened into a small foyer with a dark wooden host stand, and she had taken only 2 steps inside when a young man in a vest came out and stopped directly in front of her, not rudely, but without allowing her to go any farther. He looked at the insulated bag, then at her uniform, then pointed outside. He told her the receiving entrance was in the alley along the side of the building, all the way down the sidewalk and to the left, beneath a yellow light. Della said she was there to pick up an order, not deliver one. He said it was the same either way. She walked back outside, turned into the narrow alley, which was barely wide enough for a garbage truck, past 3 steel trash bins and a stack of empty beer crates, then stood beneath the yellow light and rang the bell. It took 4 minutes for the door to open. The man who answered appeared to be in his late 40s. He wore a white shirt, buttoned all the way to the collar, with the sleeves neatly rolled in exactly 2 folds, and for the first few seconds, he said nothing. He merely stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance as he studied her. Della held out her phone so he could scan the code. He picked up the scanner from a table against the wall, scanned the code, then signed the confirmation on the screen, slowly, 1 stroke at a time, as though the act required careful consideration. She could read the name tag pinned to his shirt. Grant Halloran, manager. He handed the phone back but didn't release it immediately. He held on for half a second, and in that half second, he looked directly into her face. Della was accustomed to people glancing at her and then looking away. That was the entire purpose of the makeup. But this man didn't look away. He studied her longer than necessary for a pickup that should have taken 90 seconds, looking at her the way someone looks at something familiar but can't remember where they've seen it before, his eyes narrowing slightly at the corners. Then he released the phone and said the order was on the table, 3 boxes, and asked her not to tilt them. Della packed the containers into the insulated bag, zipped it shut, and turned away. When she reached the end of the alley, she glanced back once. He was still standing in the doorway beneath the yellow light. He hadn't closed the door, and he was still watching her. She walked faster until she reached the sidewalk. At 10 o'clock that night, in the wine cellar beneath that same building, a man named Pete Rossi stood in the narrow aisle between 2 rows of wooden racks, while Vittorio Sorrentino sat on a stool 3 paces away, his hands resting on his knees. On the wine barrel lying horizontally between them was a stack of printed papers. Vittorio didn't pick it up. He merely stated the amount, $41,800, over 14 months, withdrawn through 3 suppliers that didn't exist. Pete began talking about his wife, the loan, and something involving the hospital, and Vittorio allowed him to finish without interrupting once. When Pete fell silent, Vittorio said he didn't care about the reason. Then, in the same even voice he might have used to read an inventory list, he said the house in Medford would be transferred into another name that week, along with the truck and the 2 business licenses. The account at the bank on Salem Street would be closed the following morning, and Pete Rossi's name would be removed from every shipping contract between Boston and Quincy. Pete asked what else there was. Vittorio said there was nothing else. He told Pete that he would walk out through that door. No one would touch him. No one would be waiting for him on the street. And his wife would never know what had happened unless he chose to tell her himself. Then Vittorio spoke the final sentence, and it was the only one he delivered a little more loudly. He said people who weren't involved were never part of any bargain. Never. And anyone who violated that rule would no longer have a place in this house. Pete Rossi left. The cellar door closed. Arturo Mancini stepped out from behind the last row of racks with 2 glasses of wine in his hands. He gave one to Vittorio, then sat on the wooden crate across from him. He said the punishment had been too merciful. Vittorio didn't answer. Mancini took a sip, then shifted to another subject, his voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather. He said the Orsini side had reached out. They wanted to lease the 2 warehouses at Pier 7 again. The price was good. The contract was short. The paperwork was clean, and it would cover the shortfall for that quarter. Vittorio set down his untouched glass. He said no. Mancini told him they should at least hear the proposal in full. Vittorio repeated the same single word. No. He said the Orsini family made its money through things he would never allow his name to appear beside, and if his uncle wanted to raise the subject again, he could do it before the entire council, instead of bringing it up in the wine cellar at 10 o'clock at night. Mancini laughed, raised one hand to show he was letting the matter go, and went upstairs ahead of him. Vittorio remained alone. He turned off the lights along the inner row of racks, then climbed the narrow staircase that led directly into the bar of the closed restaurant. He stopped behind the counter, where a small framed photograph rested against a line of bottles. He looked at it for about 10 seconds, without touching it or adjusting its position. Then he reached for the switch panel and turned off every light in the dining room. The following afternoon, Della went offline at 4 o'clock, 3 hours earlier than usual, and drove up to Revere. Harborview Assisted Living stood 2 blocks from the beach, a 2-story building painted cream, with a plastic nameplate mounted on the brick wall. She signed the visitor log at the front desk, wrote down her name and arrival time, then walked along the first-floor corridor to room 112. Ruth Mercer was sitting in a chair beside the window, her hands resting on a stack of folded towels the staff had just brought in, and she was folding them again, one by one, even though they had already been folded. Della pulled over a chair and sat across from her. Ruth looked up. It took her about 3 seconds, and then her face brightened. She said, "You came." Della said, "Yes, I came." Ruth asked what day it was. Della said Tuesday. Ruth nodded as though she had known all along, then asked the same question again less than a minute later, and Della answered Tuesday in exactly the same voice as before, neither faster nor slower. They sat that way for a while. Ruth told her that someone had brought cake to the common room the day before, but she hadn't eaten any because she didn't like the kind with raisins. Then she told the story once more, with a few details changed, and Della listened to the whole thing both times. At one point, Ruth fell silent and gazed out the window for a long while, and Della didn't try to fill the silence. Then Ruth turned back and asked whether she had called her mother. Della said she had. Ruth said that was good. A little later, she frowned and looked around the room, as though searching for something that should have been there somewhere. Then she stopped looking, and her hand fell to her side. Della asked whether she had slept well. Ruth said she had, except that the corridor was too bright at night. She asked whether Della's leg still hurt. Della said it didn't. Ruth said Della stood all day, and too much standing would ruin her back. She knew that. Then, in the same calm voice she had used to speak about the folded towels, she said, "You need to eat properly, Delaney. You're getting thin." Della didn't correct her. She said, "Yes, I'll eat." Ruth nodded, satisfied, then turned back toward the window. About 5 minutes later, she suddenly looked at Della again, and this time her eyes were clearer, more awake, with the gaze of someone who had stepped out of the fog for a fleeting moment. She leaned forward, raised one hand, and pressed it to her granddaughter's cheek. Her thumb traced a short path beneath Della's cheekbone, and then she kept her hand there. She said, "You've hidden your face for too long." Della didn't move. Ruth continued more slowly, saying that she didn't understand everything Della was going through, but she knew Della was hiding from something, and she only hoped Della wouldn't keep hiding until the day Ruth could no longer remember her face. Della smiled, a brief smile, the kind people use to push a sentence out of the room. She said, What a strange thing to say. Then took Ruth's hand from her cheek, held it in both of hers, and changed the subject by asking whether anyone had come to visit that week. Ruth said she couldn't remember. After that, she forgot the previous conversation entirely and returned to the story about the cake with raisins, telling it again from the beginning. Della stayed for another 40 minutes. Before leaving, she stopped at the front desk and asked the woman on duty whether she could request an extension on the additional fee mentioned in the email. The woman checked the computer, then said that anything involving payments had to be handled directly with the finance department during regular business hours, and that all she could do was note the request. Della thanked her and went back to her car. It was nearly 9 o'clock when she reached the apartment in Everett. Piper Lowe was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a stack of papers beside it. She watched Della set her bag on a chair, then asked how much she had made that day. Della said $81. Piper asked how much she was still short for her grandmother's care. Della opened the refrigerator, stared inside for a few seconds, then closed it and said they had raised the fee by another $220 that month. Piper stopped typing. She said, "You have to make them give you more time, or you need to find another job. If you keep driving like this for another 6 months, you're going to break." Della didn't answer. She poured herself a glass of water, sat in the chair across from Piper, and opened her phone to review the day's delivery statistics. In the list of completed orders, there was an entry in the middle with a pickup location on Hanover Street, an unusually large tip, and beside it, a small star-shaped icon she had never seen on her account before. She rested her finger on it but didn't tap. Then she turned off the screen, placed the phone face down on the table, and told Piper she would work an extra night shift the following day. The second order from Il Verso came at noon on Tuesday, and this time Della didn't make the mistake of going to the front entrance. She parked at the mouth of the alley, walked straight to the yellow light, and rang the bell. Grant Halloran opened the door in less than 10 seconds, as though he had already been standing there waiting. He didn't hand her the order right away. He stepped back and invited her inside, saying the kitchen was still finishing the packing. Della remained at the threshold and said she could wait outside. He said it was windy out there. Then he took another step back and held the door open, and Della went inside because she couldn't think of any reason not to. Beyond the door was a narrow service corridor leading to the kitchen, with a plastic chair against the wall. He pointed to the chair. She didn't sit down. She stood there for 7 minutes. He didn't go anywhere. He remained about 2 paces from her and asked how long she had been doing this kind of work. Della said it had been a while. He asked which part of the city she lived in. She said the north side. He nodded, fell silent for a moment, then asked whether she had family in Boston. Della said the order was probably ready by now. He smiled and went into the kitchen, and when he returned, he handed her the bag and told her that next time she could come straight inside without ringing the bell. On the way back to her car, she opened the app and checked. The tip was $40. The third order came on Wednesday, also around noon. The fourth came that same evening. The fifth came Friday morning. Every time, it was the same. A sequence repeated with such precision that she began to know it by heart. The bell, 10 seconds. The invitation inside, the plastic chair, 5 to 8 minutes of waiting, a few questions that had nothing to do with the food, then the bag, then $40. By the fourth order, she noticed a small line of text beneath the restaurant's name on the order details screen, stating that the restaurant had added her to its list of preferred drivers and that its orders would be offered to her first. She opened the help section to find a way to remove her name from that list, but she couldn't find any option that would allow her to do it. During the fifth pickup, Halloran asked whether she had to work all weekend. She said it depended. He said that probably meant yes, then added that he had noticed she always remained standing and never sat in that chair. And he said it in a cheerful voice, as though he were teasing her about something small. Della didn't answer. That night, she sat in her car in the parking lot beneath her apartment building for a long time before going upstairs. She thought about declining the next order. Then she thought about $40 multiplied by 6 deliveries in 5 days, nearly half the difference she needed for the entire month, and she stopped thinking about it. The sixth order came Saturday night at 9:20, while rain was falling. Water had collected in a low spot beside one of the steel bins, and Della stepped over it before ringing the bell. This time, the light in the corridor was dimmer, and Halloran told her to move closer to the wall because the kitchen was bringing a cart through. The cart passed close beside her, stacked with trays, and the top tray tilted when one of the wheels struck the edge of the doorway. A streak of tomato sauce splashed across her face, running from her chin to her right cheekbone. The man pushing the cart apologized profusely before continuing on his way. Della raised the back of her hand to wipe it away. Halloran told her to wait. He reached for a cloth napkin on the rack, dipped it into the hand-washing basin beside the wall, wrung out the excess water, then said, "Let me. You can't see where it is." He lifted the napkin to her face. He didn't touch her skin. There was only the wet cloth as he wiped upward from her chin to her cheekbone in one stroke, then passed over the same place a second time, harder. The red stain disappeared. Along with it went a patch of foundation. Della knew at once, even before she could jerk her head back, because she felt the cold air touch a patch of skin that nothing had reached in 4 years. She stepped back and covered her cheek with her hand, but Halloran had already gone still. He was holding the napkin suspended in midair, his arm frozen in place, and he wasn't looking at the cloth. He was staring at the small patch of skin newly exposed on her cheekbone. Then his eyes moved upward across the rest of her face. Slowly, very slowly, like a man placing one photograph over another to see whether they matched. The rain outside struck the lid of the steel bin. Someone in the kitchen called out the name of a dish. Halloran didn't turn toward the voice. He lowered his hand, and the napkin fell onto the edge of the rack. Then, so quietly that he seemed almost to be speaking only to himself, he said a name. Delaney. Della couldn't remember how she had made her way out of the alley. She only remembered that when she finally sat down behind the wheel, the insulated bag was still hanging from her shoulder, and she had to use both hands to remove it because one hand wasn't steady enough. She took a tissue from the glove compartment, wiped her right cheek clean, then wiped the rest of her face, and she sat that way for 7 minutes in the dark parking lot before starting the engine. The first thing she did on the morning of the 8th day was open the app and search for a way to block that restaurant. She went through settings, privacy, regional preferences, then opened the help section and typed her question into the search bar. The system returned a lengthy article explaining that drivers could decline orders, but a low acceptance rate would affect their ranking, and that drivers placed on a restaurant's preferred list could be removed only by the restaurant itself. There was no button. She called customer support. After waiting on hold for 19 minutes, a representative told her that he was very sorry, but he didn't have the authority to change a restaurant partner's preferred driver list, and if she felt uncomfortable, she could simply decline the order. Della asked what would happen if she declined it. He said the order would be offered to another driver after 30 seconds, and her acceptance rate would fall. She thanked him and ended the call. That day, she completed 11 deliveries, none of them in the North End, and she checked the screen after every drop-off the way people check their rearview mirrors. At 6:10, on the morning of the 9th day, a push notification appeared before her first order had even come in. Her account was under review for a violation. She opened it and read. A restaurant partner had filed a complaint stating that the driver had mishandled an order, damaging the food and forcing the restaurant to issue the customer a refund. The date listed on the complaint was the 7th day. Beneath it was a line in bold stating that this was her first warning and that one additional recorded violation within 90 days would result in permanent termination of her access to the platform. Della read it 3 times. She tapped the button to appeal the decision and wrote in the empty box that she hadn't damaged the order, that the incident had been caused by a cart in the restaurant's own kitchen, and that a kitchen employee had witnessed it. She stopped before pressing submit and deleted everything. Then she typed a shorter sentence, saying only that she disagreed with the complaint, and pressed submit. The system sent an automatic response, stating that her appeal would be reviewed within 5 to 7 business days. She sat in the car for a long time. She had earned $240 from 6 orders at that restaurant, and now a single word from that man could erase her only source of income, and both things rested in the hands of one person. On the evening of the 9th day, after Piper had gone to bed, Della sat at the kitchen table with the laptop she had borrowed from her roommate. She opened a new browser window, placed the cursor in the search bar, and typed her real name. She didn't press enter. She sat there staring at those 8 letters against the white background for about 15 seconds, her hands still resting on the keyboard. Then she folded the screen down without deleting the words or closing the browser. She simply closed the laptop, pushed it toward the center of the table, and remained in the dark kitchen a little longer before going to bed. That same evening, in a room above the restaurant on Hanover Street, Vittorio Sorrentino was comparing 2 sets of Il Verso's quarterly revenue reports. He did it 4 times a year, and it usually took him less than an hour. This time, he stopped at the temporary staffing expenses. The total matched the budget, but the weekly allocation didn't, and the number of shifts recorded for the service staff exceeded the number of people who had actually appeared on the timesheets he had reviewed the previous month. The difference wasn't large, about $19,000 over 2 years, spread out so evenly that no single week contained enough to make anyone look up. He didn't call Grant Halloran. He summoned Benny Falco, pushed the papers across the desk, and said he wanted to know where the money had gone, who had signed for it, and who had benefited. Benny asked whether he should question the manager directly. Vittorio said no. He was to question no one and tell no one, not even anyone in the family. Benny nodded, picked up the papers, and left. Vittorio remained seated, turned off the desk lamp, and gave the matter no further thought until the following morning. The 10th day passed quietly. Della completed 13 deliveries, none of them from the North End, and she began to believe the complaint had brought the matter to an end, that they had removed her name from the list, and that everything had stopped there. Then, at 10:52, on the night of the 11th day, while she was driving home with only 2 traffic lights left before the overpass, the phone in its holder gave a sharp chime. A new order. Pickup location, Hanover Street. Scheduled time, 11 o'clock at night. Della let the order run for 28 of the 30 seconds allowed. She watched the countdown shrink on the screen and thought about the bold warning concerning a second violation, thought about the $214 in her account, thought about Ruth sitting beside the window folding towels, and at the 29th second, she tapped accept. She turned the car around at the next red light. At 5 minutes to 11, she parked at the mouth of the alley off Hanover Street. The dining room lights were off, with only a faint glow coming from the kitchen in the back, and the yellow light above the receiving entrance was still on. She kept her keys in her coat pocket instead of putting them in her purse, then rang the bell. The door opened almost at once. Grant Halloran stood there, without the white shirt he usually wore and with no scanner in his hand. He told her to come inside, saying the order was at the bar. Della said she would wait there. He said the restaurant was closed, and that if she stood outside, the whole neighborhood would see her. Then he stepped backward and left the door open, and Della remained at the threshold for exactly 3 seconds before crossing it. She heard the door close behind her. Then she heard another sound, shorter this time, the turn of a lock. She looked back. Halloran was pulling the key from the lock and slipping it into his trouser pocket. He said there had been a lot of trouble outside lately, so it was safer to keep the door locked. Della said she would take the order and leave immediately. He nodded and walked ahead, leading her through the service corridor. He didn't turn into the kitchen, but continued straight into the dark dining room, toward the long bar that ran along the wall on the right. There was no order bag on the counter. There was only a sheet of paper lying face down on the wood. Halloran stood on the other side of the bar, turned the paper over, and pushed it toward her. It was a low-quality color printout, a screenshot of an old post. The photograph showed a young woman of 22 wearing a kitchen uniform, her hair tied high, her face free of makeup, standing in an industrial kitchen and smiling at the person behind the camera. Beneath the image was a caption and a name. Della didn't pick up the paper. She stood half a step from the bar with her arms hanging at her sides, looked at the page exactly once, then raised her eyes to him. Halloran said, 2 years. He said he had been looking for her for 2 years, that he had printed that picture more times than he could remember and shown it to more people than he could count, while she had been standing right outside his back door, week after week, directly in front of him. He said he had nearly missed it that rainy night. Della told him he had the wrong person. He laughed. He said she didn't make that sentence sound very natural. Then he reached for the bar towel hanging over the faucet behind the counter, dipped it into the sink, and wrung it out with one hand. He said, "Then prove it. Let me see your real face, and I'll let you leave right now. It'll only take 10 seconds. Della stepped back. He came around the end of the bar faster than she had expected, and she didn't have time to take a second step. He raised his left hand and seized her chin, his fingers tightening along both sides of her jaw, while his right hand pressed the wet towel against her cheek and scrubbed downward, upward, then sideways, hard and fast, as though he were wiping a stain from a tabletop. Della jerked her head to the left, then to the right, but his other hand didn't move. She raised both hands and pushed against his chest, but he didn't budge. She felt the foundation coming away in patches, felt the cold air touching each newly exposed stretch of skin, felt her eyeliner being smeared beneath her eyes. He stopped after the fourth stroke. He released her chin, stepped back half a pace, and said nothing for about 3 seconds. Then he laughed, a short sound through his nose, and said, "Hello, Delaney Mercer. 4 years. You've done well for yourself." Della turned and ran toward the corridor. He blocked the passage with a single step to the side. She changed direction and ran toward the dining room's front entrance, and he told her that door had been locked since 8 o'clock. Della stopped between 2 rows of tables with chairs turned upside down on top of them. Halloran said she was going to sit down and listen, because there were several people who very much wanted to know where she was, and he needed something he could trade. He began walking toward her. Della backed away until her spine struck the edge of the bar. Her right hand reached behind her and touched the neck of a glass bottle standing on the counter. She seized it, turned, and brought it down hard against the edge of the wooden bar. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the empty dining room. Halloran swore, grabbed her wrist, and twisted it outward. The bottle fell to the floor, and then he drove her backward into the bar. Her back struck the wooden edge, and he pinned her there with his entire forearm. At that exact moment, at the far end of the dining room, the door leading down to the wine cellar burst open. Vittorio didn't immediately remove his hands from the edge of the bar on either side of her. He remained that way for another moment, long enough to make certain she wouldn't bolt for the door and run into the dark alley alone, and only then did he speak. He said, "From tonight on, it is." His voice was no louder than it had been when he asked the question before. Then he continued, his tone even and unhurried, saying that he wasn't talking about ownership, that he didn't need her to belong to him in whatever sense she was imagining at that moment, and that if she wanted to leave in the morning, no one would stop her. He said what he needed was for anyone who touched her from that moment forward to answer to him first, and she didn't have to agree to that because it was already the way things were. He lowered his hands and stepped back a pace and a half. Della remained against the bar. She said nothing. He asked nothing more. He turned toward the wine cellar stairs and called out a name, and in less than half a minute, 3 men entered the dark dining room. Vittorio pointed toward the floor and told them to get him out of there. One of the men asked where they should take him. Vittorio said to put him in a car, drive him out of the North End, and tell him once, clearly, that if he ever crossed Salem Street again, no one would be calling a car for him the next time. He added that they were to call Dr. Petrucci, not for Halloran, and tell Benny to bring the keys and open the alley door to let some air inside. Then he switched on a row of lights at the far end of the dining room, instead of the main lights, lifted a chair down from one of the tables, placed it on the floor, and pushed it toward Della. She sat down. Dr. Petrucci arrived 20 minutes later, an older man carrying a worn leather bag, and examined Della's right wrist and lower back there at the table, asking whether she felt dizzy, whether she was nauseated, and whether it hurt when she took a deep breath. Della answered each question in turn, briefly, her voice so normal that even she found it strange. He said nothing was broken, that her back would be bruised for about a week, and he left 2 pills in a small paper bag before departing. Benny Falco had stood a few paces from the table the entire time, and after the doctor left, he came forward, sat in the chair across from her, and placed his phone on the table. He said there were 2 things now. The first was that he would drive her all the way home, and someone would bring her car back to her in the morning. The second was that if she wanted to file a report, there was an officer in District 1 whom this house knew, and that officer would take her statement that very night, right there, without requiring her to go to the station. If she didn't like that arrangement, they could call 911 in the usual way. Either way, there were witnesses, and there was a camera in the service corridor. When he finished, he sat and waited. Della shook her head. Benny told her to think about it, that she didn't need to answer that night, that she could answer the next day, or even 3 days later. Della said no. Benny said, "You know they can prosecute him for this, don't you?" It was recorded. People saw it. Della said she wasn't filing a report. She said it clearly and quickly, without the slightest hesitation, then added that she didn't want her name appearing anywhere, not in a report, not in a file, not on any piece of paper bearing an official seal. Benny opened his mouth to say more. From where he stood 3 paces away, Vittorio said, "Enough." Benny nodded and picked up his phone. Della asked whether she could have her insulated bag from the corridor. Benny went to retrieve it for her. While she waited, Vittorio didn't ask her a single question. He leaned against the edge of the bar with his hands in his pockets and studied her the way he studied a report containing a number that didn't add up. He had heard hundreds of people refuse the police in his lifetime. People refused because they had criminal records, because they didn't have legal papers, because they owed someone, because they feared retaliation, and there was always something furtive in the way they refused. A pause before they spoke, a glance toward the door. This girl showed none of those things. She sat with her back straight, looked directly into Benny's face when she answered, and said no, like someone who had answered that question many times before, enough times that she no longer needed to think about it. It wasn't fear. It was a decision made long ago, somewhere else, because of something else. Benny returned with the bag. Della stood, slipped its strap over her shoulder, and followed him toward the corridor. Near the door, she stopped and turned back, then said only one thing to the man standing by the bar. "Don't look into me." Then she walked out. Vittorio remained in the dark dining room, listening as the alley door closed, and he stood there until the sound of the engine outside gradually faded and disappeared. Benny Falco returned to Hanover Street at 1:15 in the morning, after watching Della reach the door of her apartment in Everett before driving away. He didn't ask Vittorio what he planned to do next. He went straight to the second floor, to the small room Grant Halloran still used as his management office, and called in a locksmith at 1:40. The safe was set into a recess in the wall behind a board displaying the staff schedule, an old office safe, and the locksmith opened it in 22 minutes. Vittorio stood in the doorway when the safe swung open. There was no money inside, no guns, only paper. 4 stacks of folders stood upright, bound with rubber bands, and a black ledger lay at an angle on the lower shelf. Benny removed the first stack and opened a file from the middle. Vittorio stepped over to the desk and opened a second. Each file belonged to one person. The first page always held a photograph, most of them secretly taken from a distance or pulled from social media, pasted into the upper left corner. Beneath it were a name, an age, an address if one could be found, followed by a series of entries filled in with the same person's small, even handwriting. Work shifts during the week, the time the person left work. Means of transportation, who picked them up, whether they lived alone, whether anyone would call to ask questions if they were absent for 2 days. Immigration status, debt status, including the lender's name and the remaining amount, whether they had family in the state. Vittorio read the entire second file, then opened the third, then the fourth, and after that he stopped opening them one by one and quickly flipped through the folders to count them. The first stack contained 72 files. The second contained 94. The remaining 3 stacks were thicker. When Benny finished counting, he said the final number was 311. Most of them were servers, kitchen assistants, janitors, and dishwashers. Some were delivery drivers for app-based platforms, and not all of them had ever worked at Il Verso. Many had simply passed through that alley door several times a week. The black ledger contained no names. It held only dates, a series of initials in the middle column, and numbers in the column on the right. Benny compared the first few entries with the files, then looked up and said this wasn't extortion. Halloran hadn't demanded money from the people in those files. Halloran had sold the files themselves, or more precisely, the information inside them, to other people. Benny said every entry revolved around one question, and that question was how long it would take someone to start looking if this person disappeared. Vittorio didn't answer. Benny continued turning the pages toward the back of the ledger, tracing the column of initials until he stopped. He said the same sequence of letters appeared in nearly half the entries from the past 2 years, and that those letters were how the Orsini name was commonly abbreviated in the ledgers of several places in Chelsea. He said the total amount in the right-hand column came to roughly the $19,000 discrepancy Vittorio had found in the quarterly reports, plus another $30,000 that had never passed through the restaurant's books. Vittorio closed the file lying open before him. He placed it back where it belonged in the stack, straightened the folder edges until they aligned, then slid the entire stack back into the safe. He did it slowly and neatly, without shoving or throwing anything. Then he closed the safe door and turned the handle. The sound of the bolts sliding into place was the only sound in the room. He told Benny that not a single sheet was to leave the building. Nothing was to be copied, and no one was to be told, not even Mancini. Benny asked what they should do about Halloran. Vittorio said to let him go wherever he wanted, because he no longer had anything in his hands. And Vittorio wanted to know whom Halloran had been meeting on the other side for the past 2 years, not where he was now. Then Vittorio went downstairs. He didn't pass through the dining room. He took the service corridor, walked past the plastic chair against the wall, and pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen. The kitchen had been cleaned at 11 o'clock. The steel surfaces gleamed, the stoves were cold, and only the row of nightlights above the sink remained on. Vittorio stopped in the central aisle between the 2 rows of steel tables. His mother, Annette, had opened this kitchen with money borrowed from 3 neighbors and had stood in that exact place 14 hours a day for 11 years. When Vittorio was still too short to reach the counter, she had given him one rule: that anyone who worked in this kitchen would eat until they were full and would go home. For the past 2 years, while he sat upstairs reviewing the quarterly figures, someone had stood downstairs making lists of the human beings who passed through his mother's back door and selling them like inventory in a warehouse. He reached out and adjusted a steel tray sitting crooked at the edge of a table, pushing it into line with the others. Then he turned off the row of nightlights and walked out. At 7:12 the following morning, Della's phone vibrated while she sat in her car in the parking lot behind the supermarket. The notification stated that after review, the platform had recorded an additional violation connected to a restaurant partner's complaint, and her account had been permanently denied access. Beneath it was a line stating that the decision was final and that no further appeals would be accepted. The black car was parked at the curb across from the building, about 130 feet from the entrance, and Della noticed it on the morning of the 14th day because it had been sitting there since the previous afternoon. She walked straight across the street, knocked 3 times on the driver's window, and when the glass lowered, she told the man inside to call his boss and tell him to get out of the neighborhood. The man said he was only sitting there. Della said, "I didn't ask what you were doing here. I told you to make the call." He called. 40 minutes later, Vittorio Sorrentino stepped out of a car at that exact spot. Della was already waiting on the sidewalk. She said, "I told you not to look into me." He said, "I haven't looked into you. I only put a man on the street." She said, "Then take him away." He said, "No." Della said, "You saved me once, and I'm grateful for that. But saving me once doesn't mean I become an item on your list of possessions. It doesn't mean you get to station a man outside my home. It doesn't mean you get to make any decisions for me." He said, "Have I said a single word about owning you?" She said, "You said an entire sentence about it that night." He said, "I said that anyone who touched you would answer to me, and that had nothing to do with you. That was between me and them." Della said, "I'm not an excuse for you to settle your own business." He said, "That's right, you aren't." She said, "Then stop." He said, "No." Della stood still for several seconds before saying plainly what she had been thinking for 2 nights. She said, "You saw my face that night, and now you've put a man outside my building, and I've met enough kinds of men already, so don't waste your time." Vittorio looked at her. He said, "If you think I'm doing this because you're beautiful, then you haven't understood anything." Then he continued, his voice never rising, saying that he didn't care what her face looked like, that he had come up from the wine cellar that night to retrieve a file, not to look at anyone, and that what he had seen inside his own house that night was something he would have to live with for a very long time. He said, "I don't need you to believe me. Get in the car. I'll show you something. 15 minutes. Then I'll have someone take you home, and if you still want me out of this neighborhood, I'll withdraw the man." Della got into the car. Il Verso was empty at noon that day. Every light in the dining room was on, but there were no guests. Vittorio walked behind the bar, picked up a small framed photograph propped against a row of bottles, and placed it on the counter in front of her. In the photograph, a woman stood in an industrial kitchen, still holding a ladle, her hair tied beneath a scarf, smiling at the person behind the camera. He said, "This is my mother, Annette." The picture was taken in 1989, in the very kitchen behind this wall. The year she opened it, and the year I was born. Della looked at the photograph. He said, "Over the past few days, I discovered that the man I trusted to oversee that kitchen had turned it into something else entirely." And he said nothing more about it. He said the restaurant's pastry work was currently being handled by an outside contractor 3 days a week, and the quality was acceptable. He said, "I want you to take over." He said the salary would be 3 times the average for that position in Boston. It would be a permanent job with insurance. The shift would begin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and she would have complete control over the dessert menu. Della said no. He didn't ask why. She said, "I don't accept jobs from people I owe. I don't want to spend every day wondering whether I'm working here because of my skill or because of what happened that night." He said, "All right. Then he told her she could go home and called someone to drive her. Della had reached the alley door when the phone in her pocket vibrated. She stopped beneath the yellow light and opened the message. It was an email from Harborview Assisted Living, sent at 12:41, reminding her that the supplemental payment for the current billing period hadn't been made, that 16 days remained before the deadline, and that if the payment became overdue, the file would be transferred to the department responsible for reviewing care options. Della read the entire message. Then she read it again. She stood beneath that yellow light for about half a minute, holding the phone in her hand, thinking about the $960 she had earned during the final 7 days before her account was closed, thinking about how long it would take another platform to approve a new application, thinking about Ruth sitting beside the window in room 112, folding towels. Then she turned back. She walked inside again, returned to the bar, and said, "I'll take it." Vittorio gave a single nod and said, 2:00 tomorrow afternoon. He didn't ask why she had changed her mind. He didn't say anything else, and that was what unsettled her most. On the way home, Della sat in the back seat and stared through the window, hating herself for turning back, hating herself because she had known she would turn back even before she finished reading the final line of the email. On her first day of work, Della arrived at 1:40 and waited 20 minutes in the service corridor because no one had told her which entrance to use. The head chef was a man named Frank Bevilacqua, in his early 50s, and he gave her a 4-minute tour, showing her the pastry corner at the end of the line, 2 convection ovens, a proofing cabinet, and a long steel table. Then he told her that dinner service began plating at 5 o'clock, and he walked away. No one shook her hand. There were 11 people in the kitchen, and every one of them wore a bare face. It was an unspoken hygiene rule that everyone understood. And Della entered wearing foundation 2 shades darker than her skin, eyebrows drawn in black pencil, and burnt orange lipstick, surrounded by 11 faces with nothing on them at all. She felt the rhythm of the silence change as she passed the row of stoves. By her 3rd shift, the whispering had begun. Someone spoke in Italian near the sink. Someone else spoke in English, but kept his voice just low enough, and Della caught fragments. The new girl, brought in by the owner, never went through the head chef. Then there was a shorter remark about how she wore makeup as if she worked somewhere else instead of in a kitchen. A young kitchen assistant passed her table and jokingly asked whether there was a mirror around there, and several people nearby laughed. Della didn't answer. She pulled the stainless steel rack closer and began her work. For the first 2 weeks, she followed the old menu, changed nothing, suggested nothing, and spoke to no one except Frank, and even then only about the number of portions required. She arrived 20 minutes early every day and was the last to leave. During the 3rd week, on a Thursday evening, Frank came to the pastry corner and said the people upstairs wanted dessert for a table of 12 on Saturday night. They were regular guests, and he didn't like anything on the existing menu. He asked what she could make. Della said, "Sfogliatelle." Frank looked at her. He said there were 3 places in the city that could make them properly, and none of them paid what they paid, a contract pastry cook working 3 shifts a week. Della said, "Then let me make a batch tonight, taste them, and then decide." Frank shrugged and walked away. She began at 6 o'clock. She made the dough first, rolling it out, letting it rest, then rolling it again, and she repeated the process more times than anyone in the kitchen thought necessary, stretching the sheet thinner and thinner across the steel table until the grain of the metal beneath it could be seen through the dough. She rolled it into a long cylinder and placed it in the refrigerator. While she waited, she prepared the filling, and she made it 3 times. She threw away the first 2 batches and kept the 3rd. By 9 o'clock, the kitchen had begun to quiet as the guests thinned out, and the cooks at the hot stations started cleaning their areas. Della took out the cylinder of dough, cut it into thin, even rounds, then began the most difficult part of the pastry, the part that could only be done by hand. With both thumbs, she pressed outward from the center of each round, letting the layers slide over one another until they formed a cone, one after another, without tearing a single one. She made 36 in 22 minutes. The young kitchen assistant from earlier walked past, stopped, and remained there watching. By the 15th pastry, 2 more people had stopped beside him. Della didn't look up. She filled each one, arranged them on a tray, and put them in the oven. 18 minutes later, she opened the oven, and the fragrance that poured through its door made the entire kitchen line turn around at once. Frank Bevilacqua approached, picked one up by his fingertips even though it was still hot, and broke it in half. The layers of pastry separated into delicate, curling sheets, crisp enough to be heard. He took a bite. Then he stood there, chewing without a word, staring at the remaining half in his hand longer than necessary. He placed it back on the tray. He said, "Make 40 for Saturday night." Then he turned away and called out to the entire kitchen that anyone still standing around should go clean their station, and no one said another word about her makeup. Not that night or on any night that followed. From that evening onward, something changed, though no one in the kitchen ever spoke of it aloud. Vittorio Sorrentino began coming downstairs. He came down around 8 o'clock, sometimes later, walked through the swinging door, pulled out the stool in the corner near the dry storage room, and sat there. He didn't speak to Frank. He didn't inspect anything. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees and watched the far end of the line, where a woman stood rolling dough. He remained there for about 40 minutes every night. Some nights, he stayed longer. The people in the kitchen gradually became so accustomed to his presence that by the 4th week, no one turned around when the door opened anymore. Della knew he was sitting there. She didn't look toward that corner of the kitchen even once. She simply continued working, and he continued sitting there watching her, and for 3 straight weeks, neither of them spoke a single word to the other, except about work. Benny Falco came up to the 2nd-floor office on Tuesday afternoon of the 4th week, carrying a thin folder, and placed it on the desk in front of Vittorio before stepping back. He said, "You told me to find out whom Halloran had been meeting on the other side for the past 2 years, and I did. But while I was following that trail, a name surfaced, and it had nothing to do with the ledgers." Vittorio asked what name. Benny said, "Just read it." Then he added, "You told me not to look into her, and I didn't. This was already sitting in the public court records." Then he walked out and closed the door behind him. The file was 11 pages thick. The first page was a copy of an incident report filed with the Boston Police Department 4 years and 2 months earlier. The reporting party was listed as Delaney Mercer, 22 years old, kitchen assistant, employed at a restaurant on Boylston Street. The allegation was summarized in 3 dry lines on a standard form. It concerned a female co-worker of the reporting party at a private event held by clients who had rented the entire restaurant after closing, and the reporting party's statement that she had personally seen a guest named Trevor Ashford put something into the co-worker's drink. The second page was a list of witnesses named in the original report. 14 employees had been present at the restaurant that night. 13 said they had seen nothing. 1 said she had. Pages 3 through 6 contained the procedural record. The matter had been referred to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. The reporting party had been summoned to testify before a grand jury at Suffolk County Courthouse during an afternoon session that lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes. All 23 members of the grand jury had been present. Page 7 recorded the result. No indictment had been issued. Beneath it, in the notes written by the prosecutor assigned to the case, 2 lines explained why the file had been closed, written in administrative language that carried no weight at all. In essence, the physical evidence had been insufficient. The sole testimony hadn't been corroborated by any other witness, and the accused had provided a timeline of his movements during the relevant period. Page 8 was a printout from social media. 3 days after the case was closed, an anonymous account posted a portrait of Delaney Mercer, taken from her personal page, accompanied by 2 words, and beneath them were 4,300 shares within 10 days. Those 2 words were, "a liar." Page 9 was a list. Over the next 6 months, Delaney Mercer's name appeared in the personnel records of 4 different restaurants in Boston and Cambridge, with each period of employment lasting anywhere from 9 days to 6 weeks, and everyone ending with the same notation stating that her employment had been terminated during the probationary period. From the 7th month onward, that name no longer appeared in the personnel records of any food service establishment in the state. Page 10 was a petition for a legal name change filed with the court, and approved, changing Delaney to Della. The final page was a printout from another file, not part of the court record, but a photocopy of a sheet covered in the familiar small, even handwriting, with a photograph pasted into the upper left corner. The picture showed a young woman in a kitchen jacket, smiling inside an industrial kitchen. Benny had written in pencil along the margin that the page had come from the 4th stack in the safe, and that in the final entry, the one asking how long it would take someone to start looking if this person disappeared, the answer had been left blank. Vittorio read all 11 pages. Then he read the second page again, the page with the number 13, and the number 1. He closed the folder, rested both hands on top of it, and remained that way for a while. Then he rose, crossed the room, opened the glass door leading to the small balcony overlooking Hanover Street, and stepped outside. Down below, a delivery truck was backing up. He placed both hands on the iron railing and stood there. For 3 straight weeks, he had spent 40 minutes every evening, sitting in a kitchen, watching a woman make pastries. And throughout those 3 weeks, he hadn't asked her a single question. It wasn't because he respected what she had told him in the dining room that night. It was because he believed that time would eventually reveal everything on its own, as it always had with every person he had ever known. He looked down at his right hand, gripping the railing. His fingers were trembling. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. Not in the wine cellar. Not in any room he had ever entered to speak with men who carried guns beneath their coats. He released the railing and closed his hand into a fist, then opened it, then closed it again. He remained on that balcony until the truck below finished backing up and disappeared down the street. Then he went inside, picked up the folder, and locked it in the drawer on the right side of his desk. That evening, Vittorio came down to the kitchen later than usual, close to 10 o'clock, when the evening shift had finished cleaning and only Della remained at the far end of the line, wiping down a steel counter. He didn't sit on the stool in the corner. He walked straight to the other end of the long table, stood there, and said, "There's something I want to tell you. It isn't about work. Once you've heard it, you can walk away whenever you want." Della set down the cloth. He said, "I had a younger sister named Noelle. She was 9 years younger than me. She studied design. She hated this house, and she hated the work I did. When she was 22, she went to a rooftop party at a building in Seaport, hosted by an acquaintance of one of her friends, and she never came home." He said it had happened 6 years earlier. Then he continued without pausing, his voice even, as though he were reciting something he had read too many times. He said, "There were 30 people on that rooftop that night. The police recorded 30 names, questioned 30 people, and all 30 gave exactly the same account. They hadn't seen anything. They had been on the other side of the rooftop. The music had been too loud. They remembered seeing her at the beginning of the evening, but not afterward. Not one of those 30 people lied clearly enough for anyone to challenge them. They simply hadn't seen anything, all at the same time, in exactly the same way. And that isn't a crime." The case was closed after 4 months. There was no indictment, no trial, and no one was ever questioned a second time. He said, "I was 31 then, and I already had everything people imagine should be enough to solve anything. I had money, and I spent a great deal of it. I hired 2 private investigation firms. I paid 3 lawyers for 11 months. I paid someone inside the department so I could read things before I was supposed to read them. I had people, and I sent them to meet privately with 17 of those 30 witnesses. No one was threatened. They were simply asked the same question again. I had guns, and once I sat in a car outside the home of one of those people for an entire night, with a gun on the seat beside me, and I didn't get out. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew perfectly well that nothing I did would change anything. What I needed that night wasn't a dead man. What I needed was someone willing to open their mouth, and for 6 years, I couldn't buy that. There isn't enough money in this city to buy a person willing to stand up and say, 'I saw it.'" Then he fell silent for a while. He said, "Today, I read a case file. I wasn't looking for it. It surfaced while my people were following another matter, and I read all of it. I knew I shouldn't read it, and I did." Della said nothing. He said, "There was a page in that file listing 14 people who were present. 13 said they hadn't seen anything. One person said she had." He said, "Listen carefully," and his voice slowed. "You did what 30 people wouldn't do for my sister. You were 22 years old. You were a kitchen assistant. You had nothing in your hands, and still you stood up, sat before 23 strangers, and told them what you had seen. While the 13 people who had stood beside you that night chose silence, and this entire city made you pay for it. It took your work from you. It took your name from you. It forced you to use the back door for 4 years. So I'm going to say this one more time, and I want you to hear it clearly. You don't owe me anything. I'm the one who owes you." There was no sound in the kitchen except the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Della remained where she was, one hand still resting on the edge of the steel table. She didn't say a word. 3 seconds passed, then 4, and her face didn't change at all. Then her shoulders sank slightly, so little that it was almost impossible to see, and she raised a hand to cover her mouth. The tears came after that, without a sound. She cried like someone who had forgotten how, her shoulders trembling in short waves while one hand remained wrapped around the edge of the table to keep herself upright, and she stood that way for a very long time. Throughout it all, Vittorio didn't move toward her. He remained at the opposite end of the long table, with its full length between them, and let her cry until there were no tears left. The call came at 10:40 on Monday morning of the 5th week, while Della was in the kitchen preparing for the afternoon shift. The receptionist at Harborview said that a man had come asking about Ruth Mercer the previous afternoon, claiming to be a relative. His name wasn't on the family list, so the staff had refused to let him in, and he had remained in the lobby for about 20 minutes before leaving. The receptionist said he had asked several questions about the daily routine in the first-floor wing and the times when the staff changed shifts. Della asked what he looked like. The receptionist said he was in his 40s, with short hair and a bandage across the back of his right hand. Della leaned against the edge of the steel table for about 3 seconds, then thanked her, ended the call, and went straight upstairs to knock on the office door. She said, "I need a few days off." Vittorio asked what had happened. She told him in exactly 3 sentences, adding nothing. He didn't ask another question. He picked up the phone and called Benny upstairs, and 35 minutes later, he had the names of 4 private care facilities within a 20-mile radius that still had rooms available. By noon, he had chosen one in Winchester, a private facility with access controlled by key cards, where visitors had to register in advance and present identification at the entrance. Della said, "I can't afford that place." He said, "I didn't ask you about money. I asked whether you agree to move her." She said, "My grandmother gets confused. If she moves, she'll become disoriented. It'll take her 2 weeks just to learn the new hallways." He said, "Then do you want to leave her somewhere a man can stand in the lobby asking when the staff changes shifts?" Della didn't answer. Then she said, "Yes, move her." The transfer was completed within 6 hours. Benny handled the paperwork with Harborview. A private ambulance came for Ruth at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and her medical records and prescriptions were sent directly to the receiving facility. By 5:10, Ruth Mercer was sitting in a new room on the first floor of the East Wing, beside a window overlooking a courtyard enclosed by a wooden fence. Della arranged her belongings, hung her clothes in the wardrobe, and placed the stack of towels on the arm of the chair exactly where Ruth had always kept them. Ruth asked where they were. Della said, "This is your new place. It's brighter, and there's a courtyard." Ruth asked the same question twice more within 20 minutes, and Della answered all 3 times with the same words. Vittorio stood in the hallway throughout it all. He didn't come inside. Close to 6 o'clock, when Della stepped out to sign the last few papers at the reception desk, Ruth looked through the open doorway and saw the man standing in the hall. She called out to him. She said, "You, come in here." Vittorio turned to look, then stepped into the room. She pointed to the chair across from her. He sat down. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, and then her face softened. She reached out with both hands, took his right hand, drew it toward her, and rested it on her lap. She said, "You're home so late." Vittorio didn't pull his hand away. She said, "I've been waiting since this afternoon. I finished cooking everything, but you didn't come home. I thought something had happened at the harbor again." Then she called him by a name that wasn't his, a short man's name, and continued in the voice of someone resuming a conversation that had begun many years before. She spoke about the roof leaking in the back corner, about how she had told him not to climb up there anymore, and about how their little girl had been looking thinner lately. Vittorio didn't correct her. He didn't withdraw his hand. He sat quietly, allowing his hand to remain between hers, and when she tightened her grip, he didn't move. She said, "But never mind. You're home now, and that's all that matters," repeating the sentence once more softly, before lowering her eyes to his hand and beginning to stroke its back with her thumb, slowly and steadily, with the familiar gesture of someone who had done it thousands of times throughout her life. Della returned to the doorway and stopped. She stood within the frame, still holding the papers she had just signed, and didn't enter. Inside the room, the man before whom half the Boston waterfront bowed its head, the man she had never seen anyone dare stand within more than a single step of, sat on a plastic chair in a care facility with his hand cradled in the hands of an old woman who was calling him by her husband's name. He said nothing. He simply sat there. The old woman said something else about dinner, then fell silent, and they remained that way in the stillness of the room. Della looked at the clock on the hallway wall. She stood in that doorway for 10 minutes, and throughout those 10 minutes, he didn't pull his hand away even once. By the 6th week, on a Wednesday night, the kitchen closed at 10:15, and the last person left at 10:20. Della stayed behind. She was weighing flour for the next day's shift, with plastic containers lined up across the steel counter. When she heard the swinging door open behind her, Vittorio walked to the end of the table. He didn't sit down. He placed a box of tissues on the steel surface. It was the same ordinary square cardboard box the restaurant kept in the changing room, nothing special, and he pushed it about a hand's breadth toward her. Della looked at the box. He said, "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "If you want to keep wearing it, then keep wearing it. Tomorrow too. Next year too. No one in this kitchen is allowed to say a single word about it." Then he said, "I only thought that you've been wearing it for 4 years." He said, "And it's heavy." He said nothing more. Della set down the scale. She looked at the tissue box for a long time. Her hand rose halfway, then stopped, and she let it fall to the edge of the table. She remained that way. The refrigerator hummed in the corner of the kitchen. Then she pulled out a tissue. She walked to the sink at the end of the line, turned on the faucet, dampened one corner of the tissue, and squeezed out the excess water. She returned to her place. She had no mirror. She raised the tissue to her forehead, pressed it against her skin, and drew it across in a single line. She looked at the tissue. Then she folded it and made a second pass. She moved very slowly. The foundation came away first, leaving grayish-brown streaks across the white paper. And each time she folded the tissue, she paused for about 2 seconds before continuing. She wiped her forehead, then her temples, then both cheeks. She carefully cleaned beneath her jawbone, along the line she had always deliberately left visible, and when it disappeared, her face and neck became the same color. She pulled out a second tissue. She did her eyes next, and that took longer because the eyeliner had been there since morning and wouldn't come off immediately. She had to wipe the same places again and again. Her eyes reddened from the rubbing, and at one point she had to stop completely, close her eyes, take a breath, and only then continue. She wiped away her eyebrows. The black pencil came off, revealing 2 natural curves beneath it, much thinner than the ones she had drawn. The third tissue was for her lips. She removed the burnt orange lipstick in 3 strokes, wiping away the color she had always extended beyond the natural line at the corners of her mouth. Then she stopped. She folded all 3 tissues into a small bundle in her palm. She stood there with both hands resting on the edge of the steel table, and she didn't raise her head. The entire kitchen was silent. Vittorio stood at the opposite end of the long table, exactly where he had been. He didn't step closer. He said nothing. Della lifted her head. She looked directly at him and held his gaze, without turning away, without raising a hand to cover her face, without asking him a single question. He looked at her. For one beat, he didn't move at all, and then he drew in a short breath, so faint it was almost impossible to hear. The hand resting on the edge of the table closed, then opened. For several seconds, he couldn't speak, and he was the one who had to look away first. He turned toward the row of ovens, then looked back at her. He said, "It's late. Leave that for tomorrow." His voice didn't sound the way it had before. Della nodded. She dropped the bundle of tissues into the trash can beneath the table, removed her apron, and walked out. He remained alone in the kitchen, standing there for a long while before he turned off the lights. On Friday night of that same week, every table at Il Verso was occupied. 42 seats, 3 full seatings, and a waiting list that stretched until 10 o'clock. In the kitchen, Frank Bevilacqua had been calling out orders without pause since 7, while Della stood in the pastry corner sending out desserts one after another. At 9:20, a table of 12 in the center of the dining room ordered dessert all at once, and the server assigned to that section had just been called over to the tables by the windows. Frank turned and said, "Someone who's free, take this tray to the center table." No one was free. Della wiped her hands on her apron, arranged 12 plates on the large tray, lifted it with both hands, and walked toward the swinging door that led into the dining room. It was the first time she had ever stepped into the dining room at Il Verso. She wasn't wearing makeup. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, walked out between the rows of candlelit tables, past the bar, and made her way toward the large table in the center of the room. Della had taken 4 steps into the dining room when she saw him. At table number 4, the large round table set in the center of the room beneath the vaulted ceiling, 12 people were seated, and the man with his back to the door had just risen to raise a toast. He was about 34, with neatly combed hair and the white cuffs of his shirt showing beneath the sleeves of his suit jacket, and he was smiling at the person seated to his left as he lifted his wineglass to eye level. Everyone at the table raised their glasses with him. He said something that made the two people beside him laugh, then tipped his head back and took a drink. And when he lowered the glass, he turned his face toward the center of the dining room. Della stood about 23 feet from the table. She couldn't take her eyes off that face. Over the past 4 years, she had seen it in exactly 2 photographs, one on a news page reporting that the case had been closed, and another clipped from an article about a charitable foundation. And although she had deleted both from her device long ago, she had never been able to erase them from her mind. Trevor Ashford. He sat down, placed his napkin across his lap, then leaned to the left and resumed speaking to the person beside him. Della looked at the man seated to his left. He was older, with silver hair combed back, wearing a gray wool jacket, nodding as he listened, and giving Ashford 2 light pats on the shoulder in the way a man might pat someone he had just introduced to the entire table. He occupied the host's chair. The wine on the table had come from the cellar beneath the building. It wasn't on the menu, and only left the cellar when someone in the family approved it. Arturo Mancini. The tray slipped from Della's hands. 12 porcelain plates struck the tile floor at once, and the crash echoed against the vaulted ceiling before racing through the dining room. The entire restaurant fell silent. Every person in all 42 seats turned to look. At table number 4, all 12 guests turned toward the server standing in the middle of the room, with both hands still raised at her waist, and nothing left between them. Ashford looked at her exactly as someone might look at an employee who had dropped something, his gaze lasting less than 2 seconds, his brow tightening slightly before he turned back to his wine and resumed the story he had been telling. He didn't recognize her. Mancini looked at her a little longer. Frank Bevilacqua burst through the swinging doors, pulled Della back 3 steps, and motioned for 2 servers to bring out brooms. He asked whether she had cut her hands. Della didn't answer. She let him guide her into the kitchen, through it, and out into the service corridor, where she leaned against the wall and sank to the floor. Vittorio came down 6 minutes later. He crouched in front of her in the corridor and asked for the name. Della said, "Trevor Ashford," she said. "He's sitting at the center table, in the chair with its back to the door." Vittorio asked whether she was certain. She said, "I'm certain." Then she asked who the man seated to Ashford's left was. Vittorio didn't answer that question. He rose, pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room, and walked straight to table number 4. He didn't raise his voice. He merely stood at the edge of the table, and Mancini looked up, and his uncle smiled and began to introduce him. But Vittorio said a few brief sentences, and the dinner ended within 15 minutes. Ashford shook Mancini's hand at the door, didn't shake Vittorio's, and left for his car. By midnight, the restaurant had closed completely. Vittorio went upstairs, opened the safe containing the port's shipping records, removed 3 years of ledgers from berth 7, and worked through the night with Benny Falco seated across from him. They weren't searching for anything complicated. They were looking for only one name. By 4 o'clock in the morning, everything was spread across the desk. Over the previous 2 years, 19 shipments had passed through berth 7 under the name of a transportation company registered in Delaware. The name on the license belonged to a legal entity neither Vittorio nor Benny had ever heard of, and the person who had approved every shipment on the Boston end, all 19 out of 19, was Arturo Mancini. After 3 layers of paperwork, the registered representative of that Delaware company was Trevor Ashford. The money had come from the other end, from the Orsini family. Benny turned to the final page and spoke the only sentence he had uttered in 2 hours. He said, "Your uncle brought them into your port 2 years ago, right under your nose." Vittorio didn't respond. He arranged the papers into one perfectly straight stack, rested both hands on top of it, and stared for a long time at the name printed in the lower right corner of the final page. Then he told Benny he needed one more thing. Benny asked what it was. Vittorio said, "I need to know the exact date the contract for berth 7 was signed 4 years ago, around the time her case was closed." Benny Falco took 19 hours to reconstruct the timeline, and the following evening, he laid 3 sheets of paper on the table. The first was a copy of the long-term lease for berth 7, signed between the Port Authority and a company registered under the Sorrentino name. The date of the signing was 4 years, 1 month, and 20 days earlier. The The second was an extract from the call log of the landline at the old office on Prince Street, something this family had continued to preserve out of a habit inherited from the previous generation, and it showed an outgoing call lasting 14 minutes to a number belonging to the office of a lawyer in Back Bay. A man all of Boston knew had long served as the Ashford family's legal pillar. The call had been made from Arturo Mancini's extension. It had been placed 6 days before the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office closed the case. The third was a copy of a page from the Port Authority's archived records, documenting that 2 applications to lease Berth 7 had been submitted during the same quarter, one from the Sorrentino family and the other from a consortium that listed the Ashford family among its shareholders, and that the second application had been voluntarily withdrawn. The withdrawal date was 3 days after the case was closed. Benny said nothing more. He left the 3 sheets lying side by side on the desk and walked out. Vittorio sat before those 3 sheets until nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. Berth 7 was what had changed everything. Before it, this family had owned 3 warehouses and 1 restaurant. After it, this family had 11 shipping contracts, 2 logistics companies, and a place in rooms where no one had invited him before. He had signed that contract on an April morning when he was 33, and he still remembered Mancini patting him on the shoulder on the steps of the Port Authority building and saying that if his father had still been alive, he would have cried that day. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Vittorio went down to the kitchen. Della was still there. The evening shift had ended late because it had been a busy Saturday night, and she was placing trays on a rack. He told her to sit down. She said, "I'm fine standing." He said, "Then stand." And then he told her, following the exact order of the papers, leaving out no detail and rearranging nothing to make it easier to hear. He said, 4 years ago, 6 days before your case was closed, this family's advisor made a 14-minute phone call to the Ashford family's lawyer. He said, 3 days after the case was closed, the Ashfords withdrew their application to lease Berth 7, and 1 month later, that berth came into my family's hands. He said, the contract bears the Sorrentino name. He said, it built more than half of what I have today. I've lived on it for 4 years. I've paid more than 200 people with the money it generated. I rebuilt this restaurant with money from it. He said, I didn't know about any of this when I signed it. Then he said, and what I just said changes nothing. I'm telling you only because it's the truth, not because it will make this easier for you to hear. Then he fell silent. He didn't say another word. He didn't say that he would make it right. He didn't say he was sorry. He offered her nothing she could take hold of. Della remained where she was, slowly, one piece at a time, as though checking whether she had heard him incorrectly. She repeated it back to him. She said, they buried my case. He said, yes. She said, and the price was a berth. He said, yes. She said, that berth bears your name. He said, yes. Della stepped back once. Then she took another step backward and raised one hand to the edge of the steel table behind her. She said, for 4 years I've gone around to the back door. She said, I changed my name. I abandoned my profession. I haven't dared let anyone look directly at my face. Every morning, I sit in my car and do that thing, and I do it every single day. And all this time, I thought I was hiding from a man in Back Bay. She said, it turns out that for 4 years, I've been hiding from you. Vittorio didn't answer. She looked at him and asked, do you understand what you've just told me? He said, I do. She asked, then why did you tell me? He said, because you had the right to know, and because if you heard this from someone else, I would become exactly the kind of man you've always believed I was. Della stood there a little longer. Then she reached behind her, untied her apron, pulled it over her head, and folded it. She placed it on the steel table, smoothed it once with her palm, and didn't look at him again. She walked past him, entered the service corridor, past the plastic chair against the wall, and pushed open the door at the far end. It was raining outside. She stepped into the alley beneath the yellow light without stopping, walked to the end, then turned left onto Hanover Street. Vittorio remained in the kitchen, listening as the door closed, and he didn't follow her. Vittorio called the council together on Tuesday afternoon of the 7th week, in the large room on the 3rd floor of the building on Prince Street, and all 9 men arrived on time. Arturo Mancini came first, and took the second chair on the right, the same place he had occupied for 20 years. Vittorio didn't sit. He placed 3 stacks of papers on the long table. The first contained 19 sets of shipping documents from Berth 7. The second was an extract from the call log of the old office line. The third contained the Delaware Company's registration records, with 3 layers of corporate entities stripped away until they revealed the name of the real person behind them. He said, "Uncle, please come to the center of the room." Mancini rose and stepped forward, and he didn't argue once, not while Vittorio read out every date, not when Benny Falco confirmed the signatures, not when 2 members of the council stood and moved to the far end of the room. Mancini spoke only once. He said, "You're too young to understand the price of keeping this family standing." Vittorio said, "I understand enough to know what you sold." Then he pronounced judgment. He said that every asset held in Arturo Mancini's name that had come from this family would be surrendered within 7 days, including 2 rental buildings in Medford, his shares in 3 transportation companies, and the account at the bank on Hanover Street. He said Mancini's name would be removed from every contract, every license, and every council list, and not one document belonging to this family would ever bear that name again. He said that from that day forward, not one door from Boston to Providence would remain open to him. Not a restaurant, not a dock, not a single telephone call that would be answered. He said no one was to touch him, no one was to wait for him in the street, and he would walk out of that room on his own 2 feet and live for a very long time. Then Vittorio spoke the final sentence. He said, "And no one will remember who you were." Mancini stood there for several seconds, then gave a single nod, removed the ring from his right hand, placed it on the table, and walked toward the door. No one stood to see him out. That same afternoon, in the apartment in Everett, Della stood before the bathroom mirror and studied her bare face longer than she had at any point in the past 4 years. Then she went to the kitchen table, sat down, and began to remember. She remembered the service corridor, the plastic chair against the wall, and all the time she had stood waiting for 7 minutes, 8 minutes, while that man went in and out. She remembered that on 2 occasions, he had carried a thin folder when he came downstairs from the office, and both times, instead of taking it into the kitchen, he had gone around to the cleaning supply cabinet at the end of the corridor, opened it, placed the folder inside, then locked it with his own key. She remembered something he had once said while waiting for the kitchen to wrap an order, speaking in a joking voice. That if you managed a place like this, you had to know how to look after yourself because no one else would do it for you. Della sat for a long time with those 2 details. A man who had sold information to the Orsini family for 2 years couldn't have kept only the records of the people he had sold. A man like that always kept another set for himself, one listing the buyers, the delivery dates, and the amounts paid, and he kept it somewhere no one knew about, not because he intended to use it, but because if the day ever came when the others turned against him, he would still have something to place on the table. And if the Ashford side had paid Halloran, even once, even for a single name, then those records contained something she hadn't possessed 4 years ago, something 13 silent statements and 1 solitary testimony could never replace. She remained with that thought until darkness fell. At 9:40 that night, her phone lit up. Unknown number. The first message contained only 1 line, giving the name of the facility in Winchester, the room number, and the east wing of the 1st floor. The second arrived immediately afterward and was longer. It said that he didn't need money. He needed someone who still had value to trade. It said that he had lost everything in 3 weeks and knew who had taken it from him. It said that if she came to meet him, her grandmother would never have to know about any of this, but if she didn't come, he had plenty of time, and her grandmother was in one fixed place. The third message gave an address, a refrigerated warehouse on Everett Avenue in Chelsea, and a time, midnight. Della read all 3 messages twice. She didn't call anyone. She didn't reply. She rose, went into the bedroom, and did 3 things. First, she opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand, took out an old paper envelope, and slipped it into the inner pocket of her coat. Second, she left a note for Piper on the kitchen table. It contained only the name and telephone number of the facility in Winchester, and the words, "If I'm not back by tomorrow morning, call this number first." The third thing she did in the bedroom with the door closed, and it took her 22 minutes. At 11:15, Della put on her coat, turned off the apartment lights, and went down to the parking lot. The refrigerated warehouse on Everett Avenue was a low row of steel buildings behind a container yard, and the rolling door on the east side had been raised about 3 feet when Della arrived. Inside, the storage area had long since ceased operating. The racks stood empty, and 2 industrial lights hung high overhead, casting their glow across a stretch of concrete floor. Grant Halloran stood beside a makeshift table. A few steps away, 2 men in heavy coats stood at opposite ends of the aisle, saying nothing, making no move toward her. And sitting on the edge of the table with one foot resting on the floor was Trevor Ashford. He watched her enter, and he smiled. He said, "It took me a moment to remember you." He said, "That day at the restaurant, you were standing about 23 feet from me, and I looked at you for exactly 2 seconds before turning away. Do you know why? Because you were the one carrying the plates." Della said nothing. She stopped about 4 steps from him and kept both hands in the pockets of her coat. Ashford rose from the edge of the table. He said, "4 years ago, you sat in that grand jury room for 2 hours and 10 minutes, he said. "I know the exact number, because my lawyer sat in the hallway and wrote it down." He said, "You told them everything. You spoke very clearly. You even remembered which glass had been placed where." Then he asked whether she knew why none of it had led anywhere. He said, "It wasn't because I was good. It wasn't because my lawyer was good. It was because the 23 people sitting in that room looked at you, then looked at me, and they chose." He said, "They saw a 22-year-old kitchen assistant making $14 an hour, standing there talking about an evening she hadn't been invited to attend, an evening where she was only there to wash the knives." He said, "Then they looked at me." He said, "And they chose. They chose in about 3 seconds, and the rest of those 2 hours and 10 minutes was only procedure." He said, "That wasn't injustice. That's how things work, and everyone knows it except people like you." He took 1 step closer. He said, "And the best part was what happened afterward." He said, "I heard you left the profession. You changed your name. You started delivering food. And you've been painting your face like that for 4 years?" He laughed, then said, "You did all of that because you thought I was looking for you." He said, "For 4 years, you sat in your car every morning and painted your face because you imagined someone was hunting you." He said, "Listen carefully. Not once in the past 4 years have I thought about you." He said, "No one was looking for you." He said, "You imprisoned yourself for 4 years over something no one even bothered to remember because you were never important enough for that." Halloran gave a quiet laugh behind him. Della remained exactly where she was. She didn't step back. She didn't raise a hand to her face. She let him finish, and when he spoke his final sentence, she waited another 3 seconds to make certain he had nothing more to say. Then she drew her right hand from her coat pocket. Her phone was in it. She turned the screen toward him and raised it to eye level. On the screen was an active call, not a recording stored on the device, and beneath the words indicating that the call was connected, the timer continued to run. 14 minutes and 32 seconds. Ashford fell silent. Della said, "On the other end of this call is the federal task force assigned to the Boston port investigation." She said, "I'm a cooperating witness. I signed the agreement 4 days ago, and this call is being conducted under federal authority with the consent of one party, which means everything you just said was obtained legally and can be used." She said, "You mentioned the 2 hours and 10 minutes. You mentioned the glass. You mentioned the lawyer sitting in the hallway, and you mentioned them in the exact order in which they happened." Then she spoke the final words. She said, "I didn't come here to be rescued." She said, "I came here to obtain your statement." Ashford didn't move. Then he turned his head toward Halloran and said, "Take the phone." Halloran stepped forward. Della moved back 1 step and said, "If you touch me, they'll hear everything." Halloran stopped for half a second. Ashford said, "Turn that phone off. We'll deal with the rest afterward." One of the 2 men at the end of the aisle left his position and began walking toward her, while the other circled behind her to block the way to the rolling door. Della retreated another 2 steps and tightened her grip around the phone. The screen remained lit, and the timer continued to run. 15 minutes and 9 seconds. Halloran said, "Hand it over and make this easy." Della said, "No." The first man was now only 2 steps away from her. Then the steel door at the far end of the warehouse burst open. Vittorio Sorrentino entered first, Benny Falco behind him, and they crossed the concrete floor so quickly that the man standing 2 steps from Della hadn't even managed to turn all the way around. Halloran was the first to charge. Vittorio brought him down with a single clean blow, and he fell onto the concrete and didn't rise again. The two men from the Orsini family retreated toward the rolling door, and neither of them drew anything from his coat. Trevor Ashford turned and ran toward the aisle between two rows of empty racks, but Vittorio caught him in 6 strides, seized him by the collar, jerked him backward, and slammed him against the steel shelving. Then he gripped that collar with both hands and lifted him off the floor. 6 years. For 6 years, Vittorio had sat in cars outside the homes of people who swore they had seen nothing. For 6 years, he had paid people who couldn't sell him what he needed. And now that face was in his hands, barely a handspan from his own, and there was no one in that warehouse who could stop him. Ashford couldn't speak. Benny stood at the entrance to the aisle, and Benny didn't step forward. Then Della came to him. She didn't scream. She placed her hand around his right wrist, all 5 fingers resting there, and held on. She said, "If you do this, he wins." She said, "Tomorrow, they'll write about a man murdered by a mafia boss in a warehouse, and he'll become the victim, and no one will ever hear this recording, and I'll be made a liar for the 2nd time, only this time it will be forever." She said, "It took me 4 years to get the 15 minutes we just had." Vittorio remained still for a very long time. His hand stayed clenched around Ashford's collar. Then he let go. Ashford collapsed onto the floor and sat there breathing, and no one touched him again. 35 minutes later, federal units arrived at the refrigerated warehouse on Everett Avenue. During the following week, Vittorio Sorrentino voluntarily surrendered every ledger from Birth 7, 19 sets of shipping documents, the records of the shell company in Delaware, and 4 stacks of files taken from the safe in Grant Halloran's office. Trevor Ashford was indicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Halloran was indicted for trafficking in personal information and extortion. The Orsini family's operation through the Port of Boston was dismantled within 5 months. Investigators contacted 17 people whose names appeared in the files, and 7 of them agreed to testify. Vittorio himself signed a plea agreement with federal prosecutors, accepted a sentence of 22 months in prison, forfeited more than half his assets, submitted to supervised release after serving his sentence, and didn't appeal a single provision. 2 years later, the restaurant on Hanover Street reopened under a different name. The wooden sign hanging above the front entrance bore a single word, Annette's. The liquor license displayed in a glass frame beside the reception desk was registered to Delaney Mercer because, under state law, a person convicted of a federal felony couldn't hold that license in his own name. 2 framed photographs hung on the wall behind the bar. One showed a woman standing in a kitchen in 1989, still holding a ladle in her hand. The other showed a 22-year-old woman named Noelle. Head chef Frank Bevilacqua was still there, and the young kitchen hand who had once asked whether there was a mirror in the kitchen was now the sous chef. On that Saturday morning, Ruth Mercer sat at table number 4 beside the window, and it was one of those rare mornings when her memory had returned almost completely. She watched her granddaughter emerge from the kitchen and called her by the right name. She said, "Delaney, sit down and eat with me." The front door opened. Vittorio Sorrentino walked in wearing an old coat, alone, with no one accompanying him and no car waiting outside. He stopped in the middle of the dining room. Delaney rose. He looked at her and asked the same question he had asked on that night 4 years earlier. He asked whether she belonged to anyone. She removed her apron, folded it, laid it across the back of the chair, and walked toward him. She said, "Yes." Then she said, "But this time, I chose for myself." This story leaves us with something very simple. The strongest person in the room isn't the one capable of striking, but the one brave enough to speak the truth when everyone else has chosen silence. Telling the truth can cost someone 4 years of life, but in the end, it's also the only thing that remains standing. And please remember that a person's worth has never been determined by the uniform they're wearing when they ring your doorbell, by the work they do to earn a living, or by how they appear when you glance at them in passing. The person who carries your plate, the person who delivers your food, the person who cleans for you, every one of them is somebody in the eyes of another human being. If only we looked at them for 1 second longer and believed them one more time, perhaps far fewer people would have to spend 4 years living in silence. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can continue listening to compelling stories together every day. How did this story make you feel? And have you ever met someone in real life who had the courage to speak out this way? Please leave a comment below so we can hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, happiness, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.